Thanks everybody for coming. It's wonderful to have you here tonight. I want to warn you, this is tonight is fast and furious. We're going through the entire life, pretty much the entire life of David in one class. There's three things I want to take a close look at tonight. The first is the transformation of Abishai, the one brother we haven't looked at. We're going to look at the demise of Joab, the person we looked at last time. And then we're going to look a little bit at David and the change that happens in his life and the change that happens with the people who follow him. But the first thing I want to talk about is the difference between being special and being unique. Everybody likes to consider themselves as special. It's a natural inclination to think of yourself as special. In fact, one of the programs we used to watch with my kids when I was a little kid was VeggieTales. And in VeggieTales, they have a famous quote where they say, God made you special, and he loves you very much. And for the most part, I like VeggieTales, and God does love you very much. But does God make us special? Well, God does make us special through the transformation process of faith. We are not born naturally special. In fact, the word special is very rarely found in Scripture. But our natural inclination is to think of ourselves as special. We're all single individuals, and as people of faith, we have sort of the double whammy, if you will, of thinking that because we're in such a special covenant, that therefore we must be special. In fact, I've heard baptized people talk about the kingdom and say, I can't wait for the kingdom because I want to ask Jesus what it was about me that made you pick me. And that's really not what it's about. In fact, the Scripture is very specific about that very idea. In fact, if you look at what it says in Deuteronomy chapter 7, in verse 7, and he's talking to the children of Israel, but the concept for each individual is the same. He says, the Lord did not set his love upon you, nor choose you, because you were more in number than any people. For you were the fewest of all people, but because the Lord loved you. And so what makes us special is God's love for us. It's not any sort of innate special abilities that we have or special something that makes us better than anybody else. That's not what it's about. Now think about it from our perspective that we've been talking about throughout these classes, which is that every inclination of the heart is evil continually for any individual. If every individual has the natural inclination to be evil, then how can one person be better than somebody else? We are made of the same stock. We all have the same natural inclinations. What makes us special is our relationship with God, not us ourselves. If you look at the verse that came right before Deuteronomy 7, verse 7, Deuteronomy verse 6, it says this, For thou art a holy people unto the Lord thy God. The Lord thy God hath chosen thee to be a special people unto himself, above all people that are upon the face of the earth. So what makes us special is our relationship with God. We are not of ourselves special. Or as it says in Hebrews, because the word special also means peculiar. Oftentimes in the King James we use that word. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, Peter says, But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that you should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. So we're made peculiar, or we're made different, or we're made special by God to glorify God, or as it says here, to show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. So consider David, for instance. So we talk about how David was a man after God's own heart, and he was. But the reason why he was a man after God's own heart is because God opened his heart to David. Had God not opened his heart to David, and of course this is how God opens his heart, right? So David became a man of the word. So God opens his heart to David, otherwise David's just another shepherd in the field, like all of his brothers. What made David special was the fact that God opened his heart to him, and therefore David, recognizing the wonder and the glory of God, became somebody who's after the heart of God. So hopefully that makes a lot of sense. Now, making that point doesn't mean that we're not unique. And there's a difference between special and being unique. When I use the word special, I'm talking about this idea that somehow we are innately better than somebody else. We are not innately better than somebody else. We're all in the same boat. He who hath sinned is a slave to sin, as Paul says. But we are unique. And every individual has unique characteristics. And oftentimes those unique characteristics can either be used for evil or used through God for good. And what we're going to do this morning is we're going to look at a very unique individual. We're going to look at Abishai. So I want to talk about the introduction of Abishai, and it takes place in 1 Samuel chapter 26, verse 5. So take a look at 1 Samuel 26, verse 5. And now the point of context that we're at is the time when David is fleeing from Saul. And he's in the cave, and he's got those band of ne'er-do-wells and troublemakers with him. And it's at a certain point that this happens. It says, David arose and came to the place where Saul had pitched, and David beheld the place where Saul lay. And Abner, the son of Ner, the captain of his host, and Saul lay in a trench, and the people pitched round about him. Verse 6, Then answered David and said unto Ahimelech the Hittite, and to Abishai the son of Zeruiah, brother of Joab, saying, Who will go down with me to Saul, to the camp? And Abishai said, I will go down with thee. And so this is what's happening. So David's got these band of guys. And I said Abishai is unique. And this is how Abishai is unique. Abishai was absolutely fearless. He was a totally fearless individual. We're going to see it again and again and again in the story of Abishai. He had incredible courage, and he was fearless in everything that he did. And what David wants to do is he wants somebody to go with him to literally walk into the camp of Saul and Abner, and while they're sleeping, steal something from him to show Saul that he could defeat him at any time and doesn't. So you're asking a guy to go down, creep down into just two people, you and David, creep down into the army of the enemy and walk in the middle of that army and steal the spear and the water curse of Saul. This is what he's asking to do. And he asked two guys because he didn't know who was more fearless, which one was more fearless, and Abishai was like, I'll go. And he does go. And look what happens. Pick it up in verse 8. Again, 1 Samuel 26. We'll pick up in verse 7. So David and Abishai came to the people by night, and behold, Saul lay sleeping within the trench, and his spear stuck in the ground at his bolster. But Abner and the people lay round about him. Then said Abishai to David, God hath delivered thine enemy into thine hands this day. Now therefore tell me, let me smite him, I pray thee, and I will, and the spear with the spear even to the earth at once, and I will not smite him the second time. And David said unto Abishai, Destroy him not, for who can stretch forth his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? So this is what Abishai says. He says, listen, I'll walk in there, and I'll kill him. It'll solve all our problems. We won't have to keep running away from this guy. Let's just kill him and get rid of it. Now, of course, he's going to kill him. Who's to say that Saul's not going to scream out or whatever, and Abishai's going to be in the middle of an impossible situation. He doesn't care. He's fearless. But notice what David says. David says, Destroy him not, for who can stretch forth his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? And remember, Saul was anointed by Samuel to be king. Even though he's going to lose that kingdom because of his not following the Lord, yet still David says, listen, this is the anointed. You don't get to play around with the anointed. And so this is the introduction of Abishai. But there's one other point I want to make. Notice what it says in verse 6. It says, Then answered David and said to Ahimelech the Hittite and to Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, brother to Joab. Now here's the interesting point. Abishai was the brother to Joab. But Joab hasn't even been introduced yet. We don't even know who Joab is. And yet we're told he's the brother of Joab. So why are we given that fact? Well, the reason why we're given that fact is because the story is going to be dominated by Joab. And the dominating thing about Abishai was that he was the brother of Joab. So whatever Joab did, Abishai was complicitous or duplicitous or right there with him for a time. And when that time changes, we're going to see that he's no longer referred to as the brother of Joab. He's referred to as, or Joab is referred to as the brother of Abishai. So we're going to watch for that change. So right from the beginning, he's paired up with Joab. And right from the beginning, he's the same kind of guy as Joab. Joab was also a fearless guy. Joab was a selfish guy as well. And Abishai is just like him. They're two peas in a pod, if you will, and David even comments on it at a couple different times, which we'll look at. So that's what Abishai is. He's a fearless guy, but he's just like his brother. And remember, his brother was not a good guy. So let's continue on in the story. We're going to move over to, there's Joab and Abishai right there. We're going to move over to 2 Samuel in chapter 2. We've looked at, the next few stories that we look at, we've actually looked at before. So we're going to skip over them fairly quickly. What we want to emphasize is Abishai's situation in these different stories. So this is the story that we looked at a few weeks ago when Abner and Joab are at the pool of Gibeon, and they decide to have a little contest, and 10 guys fight 10 guys, or 12 guys fight 12 guys. I really got to look it up. I can never remember whether it's 10 or 12. And they kill each other, and a whole fight breaks out, right? And so the armies of Joab and David, as they're referred to, rout the armies of Abner, and Abner takes off. And that's the story where Asahel chases after him. Remember, he was fast like a wild roe. And Asahel chases after him, and eventually Abner has to kill Asahel. And in the story, where Asahel dies, everybody stops, except for Joab and Abishai. Joab and Abishai continue right past Asahel to continue to chase after Abner. And remember, Abner and his men end up on a hill, and it starts to get dark. And Joab and Abishai are more or less alone because everybody else has stopped at Asahel. And that's when Abner says to Joab, should brother be fighting brother? And Joab, in what he likes to present as being, diplomatic, says, you're right. If you hadn't said, it's brother fighting against brother, I would have fought you all night, which is really not true. What's really true is he's in a poor position. He doesn't have an army with him, and they're on the hill. And the guy with the high ground always has the better ground. Like I said, if you learn nothing from the Battle of Gettysburg, you learn the guy with the high ground has the better ground, right? And so Joab says, I won't fight you then because we're brother against brother. Now we know that that's not true because soon thereafterwards, Abner receives the captainship, right? He's going to be the captain of the host, which is Joab's position. He's given it to him from David. And remember, David sends Abner away in peace because Abner's going to bring the armies of Israel, the armies of Ishbosheth, onto David. And Joab finds out and he's furious. And Joab calls Abner back to the gates of Hebron. And there in the gates of Hebron, he stabs him under the fifth rib and kills him. That's our man Joab. So what is the context with Abishai? Well, it's found in 2 Samuel 3, verse 30. So turn over to 2 Samuel 3, verse 30. Let's pick it up in verse 26, just so we have the context. And when Joab was come on to David, he sent messengers after Abner, which brought him again from the well of Sirah. But David knew it not. And when Abner was returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside in the gate to speak with him quietly, and smote him under the fifth rib, and he died for the blood of Asahel his brother. Verse 30. So Joab and Abishai his brother slew Abner, because he had slain their brother Asahel at Gibeon in the battle. So verse 30 is telling us is that Abishai was duplicitous in the murder of Abner, even though we see from the previous verse it was Abner that did it. I mean, it was Joab that killed Abner. But Abishai knew about it, he agreed with it, he was part of it, and it was all vengeance for his brother, right? His brother who died in a battle. It was vengeance for him. So again, you see this tight-knit connection between Joab and Abishai. And of course, David finds out about it, and he's furious that he killed Abner. And he takes the captain of the host away from him, and he makes Joab march in the funeral procession at the death of Abner. And what David says about it is found over in verse 39, 2 Samuel 3, verse 39. And this is David's feelings towards Joab and Abishai at this time. It's not about Asahel, because Asahel's already dead. So it says in verse 39, I am this day weak, though anointed king, and these men, the sons of Zeruiah, be too hard for me. The Lord shall reward the evildoer according to his wickedness. So David says, remember, he has all these sort of vagabonds and troublemakers and everybody who's now his ragtag army. And there's nobody worse than Joab and Abishai. They're uncontrollable, these two. And that's what David is saying in that verse. So let's move on to the next story. The next story takes place in 2 Samuel chapter 5, which we've looked at before as well, and that's the taking of Jerusalem. There's the quote from David in 2 Samuel 3, verse 39. And then we have the story of the water spout. Remember, the Jebusites were in Jerusalem, and they had a fortified city, and it was so well fortified that they said the lame and the blind could defend this fortification. But what David and his army found out was that there was a watercourse that began outside the city and underground led right into the middle of the city. But in order to use it, you had to come up out of the watercourse into the middle of the city. So what David says is, he says, the man here, we'll put it right up. He says, and David said on that day, whosoever getteth up to the gutter and smiteth the Jebusites and the lame and the blind that are hated of David's soul, he shall be chief and captain. Wherefore they said, the blind and the lame shall not come into the house. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion. And what we learn with the corollary account in Chronicles is this. The man who comes up out of the hole is Joab. And I'm absolutely sure that the person that David wanted to come up out of that hole was Abishai. Because the situation is perfectly set for Abishai. Because remember, the guy that comes out of that hole, he's defenseless. So you need an absolutely fearless guy to say, I'll be the first one out of that hole. And there was nobody more fearless than Abishai. And I think David knew that. And remember, David had taken the captaincy away from Joab when he killed Abner. And he's setting it up for Abishai to take it. But Joab says, no, brother. That's got to be me. I got to be in charge. I'm going to be the first one out of that hole, and you're going to be the one right behind me. And so Joab was the guy that came out of the hole, and he wins his captaincy back again at the story of the taking of Jerusalem. Again, I'm whipping through these stories because we looked at them before, but I want you to think about Abishai's situation in these stories. The next thing we're going to look at doesn't take place until it's the Battle of Rabbah. So this is what happens, and we went through the story again, so I'm going to go through quickly again. So remember, David does a kindness to the family of Jonathan, right, to Mephibosheth in 2 Samuel 9. And then in 2 Samuel 10, he decides, the kindness to Mephibosheth worked out well. I think I'll do a kindness onto Hanan, the son of Nahash, because Nahash had died, and Nahash had done some kindness onto David. And so David sends some representatives to Ammon, to Rabbah, the main city of Ammon. Ammon is the city that these guys, it's right east of the Jordan. And Hanan says, and his cohorts say, he's not really coming as a kindness. He's coming to spy out the city. Now here's an interesting thing about Ammon. Ammon, the country of Ammon, had one major city, and that was Rabbah. There was really nothing else for the most part out there. So their pearl, their great prize was their city of Rabbah. And so David sends his representatives over, and Hanan humiliates the representatives, or embarrasses, because we didn't want to confuse humiliation, embarrasses his representatives. And David is so mad about it. Remember, we talked about David's moral indignation. He's so mad about it that he sends Joab and Abishai and the armies of Israel over to Rabbah to take vengeance upon them for what they did to his representatives. And in the meantime, what Hanan does is Hanan sets up an agreement with the Syrians, who didn't like David either, to come down and help him fight. And as Joab and Abishai set themselves up in front of the city of Rabbah, they find out that the Syrians are behind them. So they've got the armies of the children of Ammon coming out of Rabbah on one side, and they've got the Syrians behind them. And that's the story where Joab says to Abishai, I'm going to take all the good guys with me, and I'm going to give you the rest of the guys. And if you get in trouble, I'll come help you. And if I get in trouble, you come help me. And he doesn't bother talking about what happens if they both get in trouble. And what happens is, it's a good military plan, right? Because Joab takes his best fighters and he fights against the army that's been bought, the Syrians. And they flee. And then when the children of Ammon see that the Syrians fled, they fled back into the city. Now here's the important thing about the story. So you had two generals there, working together, brothers, arm in arm, We're in this together, brother. You take your side, I'll take my side. And here's the key verse. It picks up in verse 14 of 2 Samuel 10. And when the children of Ammon saw that the Syrians were fled, they fled also before Abishai and entered into the city. Now listen to this. So Joab returned from the children of Ammon and came to Jerusalem. Where's Abishai? So what happens is they take a beating. Israel takes a beating because it takes them a year to get back to Rabbah. But they win the battle. When they win the battle, what happens when you win the battle is you march victorious back into Jerusalem. And Joab marched victorious back into Jerusalem by himself. There's no Abishai. Now, I don't know if Abishai stays in Ammon, but Abishai is not there with them. He was there with them when they were fighting the battle, but he wasn't there with them when it was time to take the credit. And this is the point where you start to see a split between Abishai and Joab. And Abishai starts to say, hey, wait a minute. I thought we were in this thing together, and here it is not. And the reason we know that is because what happens next. So in 2 Samuel 11, you have the story of David and Bathsheba and Uriah, which we looked at before already. And remember, David gives the note to Uriah to give to Joab and says, put Uriah at the front of the battle and back off. Joab does that. He backs off, all that kind of stuff. We went through the whole story about the birth of his second child and all that kind of stuff. But Abishai's not there. Abishai is never mentioned in the entire second battle of Rabbah. This is what I call the second battle of Rabbah. Remember, they go back a second time. So here's an interesting part of this story. I don't think I told this last time. They weren't supposed to fight against the children of Ammon. I know we talked about that, right? But because Joab has authority over the army, because the army wants to take vengeance for what had happened the year before, and David can't stop him, so Joab goes and fights against the children of Ammon. And remember, he has the sin with Bathsheba and then the death of Uriah. And then remember, Nathan comes to David. And Nathan tells him this really thinly veiled story about this guy who has a whole bunch of lambs. And he goes and takes the other guy's one ewe lamb. And David's response to that is, that man's got to pay for what he's done. And it's a really poorly veiled story of what had just happened between David and Bathsheba and Uriah. And so the thing that pops into your head is, why couldn't David have seen the obvious thing that he was talking about? And here's why. Because David thought he was talking about something else. And as soon as David heard it, he said, you're absolutely right. That's what should be done. And this is what he thought he was talking about. He thought he was talking about Joab. Because remember, Israel and Joab, you have plenty of cities, you got plenty of money, you got plenty of fruits, fruits and vegetables. You're living in a prosperous, watered, wonderful place. And right beside it is Ammon. And all Ammon has is that one little jewel, Rabbah. And Joab is in the midst of crushing that one jewel. So it fits the analogy of what Nathan talked about to perfection. And so I believe that's exactly what David thought he was talking about. And so David said, that man should pay. And then, of course, Nathan says to him, you're that man. And then David has to say, I am that man. You're absolutely right. And David admits to it, right? But through that entire story, Abishai doesn't exist. I shouldn't say he doesn't exist. He's not there. So why is he not there? Well, I believe he's not there because he's in the middle of a rift with his brother. And he's like, if you're going to take all the credit, you go on ahead. You don't need me, obviously, because you're taking the credit. And what happens actually is this. At the end of when they finally do take Rabbah, Joab calls David and he says to David, listen, you better come over here and be the conqueror as we march into the city. Otherwise, it's going to be me who conquers this city. Good old Joab always has the king's back. Don't you believe it? That's not what happened. He's doing two things. He's humiliating David in the midst of the people and the servants because David had nothing to do with the battle. And yet now David has to march in and act like the conquering hero. And he's also being duplicitous to Abishai, because Abishai was basically saying to him, if you're going to be the hero, you go ahead and be the hero. And Joab said, I'm not trying to be a hero. I just want my part of the spoil. That's all I want. And that's all Joab actually ever wanted, was his part of the spoil. So that's the story of the second battle of Rabbah, and Abishai is not there. So now we're going to move forward again. And we're going to move forward to the story of Absalom. So this is what happens to David after the sin with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah. David starts to lose the hearts of the people. And the reason he starts to lose the hearts of the people is he's no longer the moral leader that he was before. The analogy I always think of is Bill Clinton. Right? Bill Clinton, that man of hope from Little Rock or from Hope, Arkansas, was a great moral leader until he had his duplicitous situations with Lewinsky. And then he lost his moral leadership, and he wasn't the same leader after that. And the exact same thing happened between David and the people. Once David was no longer the great moral leader, he lost the hearts of the people. And that's how Absalom could stand outside the city, at the gate of the city, and say to the people that are coming in, if I was taking your case, you'd get justice. The guy inside, there's no way. There's no way to be sure what he's going to do. And he starts to lose the hearts of the people, and they start to go towards Absalom. And Absalom starts to build up an army. He starts to build up people on his side, of which the main person is Ahithophel, one of the great advisors to David. And he starts to form this army, and David's getting old, and Absalom decides it's time for a coup. And so he takes a rebellion, and he starts marching towards the city of Jerusalem. Now here's David. Absalom, his son, is coming into the city with an army. He's got an army. But if he takes his army and fights against Absalom's army, you've got family fighting against family. And David didn't want that, clearly. He didn't want brother fighting against brother in the middle of their holy city. And so what David does is David flees. And he takes off. And here's the two interesting parts of the story. This is where Abishai comes back in. Because as David flees, Abishai is with him. And you have the story of Shimei. Remember, Shimei was the guy that was throwing curses down on David as he was leaving. And Abishai says this. Here it is it's in 2 Samuel 16, verse 9. Then said Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, unto the king, why should this dead dog curse the Lord my king, Lord the king? Let me go over, I pray thee, and take off his head. There's our man Abishai, fearless to the end. So let me go cut his head off. It'll take me 2 seconds. I'll be back. You won't even notice I'm gone. You blink and I'll get it done. And David says, no. I'm not even sure that what he's saying isn't right. This is no time to go over and cut off his head. Let him say whatever he's going to say, and if he turns out to be wrong, we'll deal with it later. If he turns out to be right, we don't want to do something that's right. And so they all flee. But Joab's not there. There's all kinds of people mentioned. Remember this, if you remember the story, as he's fleeing, one person after another comes up to David. I'm going to go with you. And some of them, David even says, you don't have to go with us. You just got here. Nope, we're with you. And you get this list of all these people that go with David across the Jordan River to flee from Absalom, and Joab not mentioned. Now, he's not mentioned is not there. He's not mentioned at all. So your question is, where's Joab? He's the captain of the host. He's one of the main guys, and yet he's not mentioned. Where is he? That story's picked up in, let me see if I get, so this was 2 Samuel 16. So this is what happens. Joab keeps himself hidden. And this is what he's waiting for. Absalom has got to pick a captain. And Absalom had a relationship with Joab. We didn't go through the relationship, but Absalom had a relationship with Joab. And Joab was trying to determine who's going to be the next leader of Israel, because I want to make sure I side with the right guy. Because Joab is a conniving guy. And when Absalom starts his rebellion, you don't hear from Joab until, I wonder if I have the verse here. There's my where's Joab. 2 Samuel 17, verse 25. Turn over to 2 Samuel 17, verse 25. Joab's not mentioned at all throughout this entire event until this. And Absalom made Amasa captain of the host instead of Joab, which Amasa was a man's son, whose name was Ithra, an Israelite, and he went to Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, and sister to Zeruiah, Joab's mother. So Amasa was actually related to Joab. But you don't hear Joab's name at all until you're told, Absalom chose Amasa over Joab. And as soon as you hear Absalom chose Amasa over Joab, all of a sudden there's Joab with David in the wilderness of Jezreel and with Abishai. He wasn't there before, but now he is. So he's a smart guy, this guy Joab. He waits to see who's going to choose him, or if Absalom's going to choose him, and as soon as he doesn't, off he goes to David. He probably went and said, I fell asleep. They got out of there quickly. I didn't know what was going on. Now I'm here. And so they go over to Jezreel. They go over to the other side of the Jordan, and Absalom comes with his army, with Amasa leading the army, to chase down David and his men. And there's a clear battle going to take place, but at least it's taking place outside the country. And you know the story, David begs the three leaders. He's got three leaders now. He's got Abishai, Joab, and Benaiah. And he begs them, please be kind to my son Absalom. Whatever happens, please, please, please don't kill Absalom. Please spare my son. And the battle happens. And in the midst of the battle, Absalom is riding, I believe, a mule, if I remember correctly. And his hair gets stuck in a tree. It tells you how thick his hair was, or at least how thick the tree was. And his hair gets stuck in the tree. And people see his hair stuck in a tree, and they don't touch him because they all heard David say, please don't touch my son. Except Joab. 2 Samuel 18, verse 14. And he took 3 darts in his hand, this is Joab, and thrust them through the heart of Absalom while he was yet alive in the midst of the oak. And 10 young men that bare Joab's armor compassed about and smote Absalom and slew him. There's our man Joab. Vicious to the end. If Abishai is fearless to the end, Joab is vicious to the end. David begged. He had every opportunity. He could have arrested him. He could have brought him back to his father. No. Takes 3 spears and then has his 10 armor bearers just brutalize the guy, just massacre the guy. That's our man Joab. So continuing on, how are we doing on time? Well, actually, we're not doing that bad on time, as a matter of fact. Continuing on. So now David returns to Jerusalem, and he's coming back to Jerusalem, and good old Abishai. 2 Samuel 19, verse 21. Now they're coming back, and now Shimei is looking for a little forgiveness, right? He'd been throwing stones, and David said, "Well, let's see what happens. Let's see how it goes." And now they're coming back, and now all of a sudden Shimei doesn't feel so good about what he did. And this is what Abishai says. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, answered and said, "Shall not Shimei be put to death for this, because he has cursed the Lord's anointed?" Remember, that's what David said to him about Saul? So now Abishai's starting to learn, but he's like, hey, curse the Lord's anointed. That's what he did. He's got to pay. And of course, David says, there's been enough blood shed. We're not going to shed any more blood today. And so they march back into Jerusalem, and David becomes king once again. I know we're moving along fast. And now we're going to come to the story of the death of Amasa. So after all of this, David makes Amasa the king of the host, because he's trying to get this guy Joab out from the position. The problem is everybody that's given the job of captain of the host is killed. You know, so you don't want to be captain of the host because you got to deal with Joab. And so Amasa is now made captain of the host. And look what it says in 2 Samuel 20, verse 10. But Amasa took no heed to the sword that was in Joab's hand. So he smote him therewith in the 5th rib, and shed out his bowels to the ground, and struck him not again, and he died. So Joab and Abishai, his brother, pursued after Sheba, the son of Bichri. We don't have time to go into the story of Sheba, the son of Bichri. But the key thing to notice, the 2 key things to notice there, is there's our brutal Joab. He's not a nice guy who does bad things from time to time. He's a brutal guy that does bad things all the time. And in between, he does these things that makes him look like he calls upon the Lord and all that kind of stuff. But now you're even seeing the change. Now it's no longer Abishai, the brother of Joab. It's now Joab and Abishai, his brother. And the separation is getting further and further along. So what happens? In 2 Samuel, it's not 2 Samuel 17. It is 2 Samuel 21. So pay no attention to that man with the sword. Turn over to 2 Samuel 21, verse 15. So we're trying to show that Abishai has moved further and further and further away from Joab. Well, as he moves further and further away from Joab, he moves closer and closer to the Lord's anointed, to David. And Abishai is only going to be mentioned a couple more times in the record. Joab is mentioned a bunch of times, but Abishai is only going to be mentioned a couple more times. And one of the times here is in 2 Samuel verse 21, verse, we're going to pick it up in verse 15. And now David is really starting to get old. And he's still fighting in battles. And look what happens. We'll pick it up in verse 15 and then go to 17 there. Moreover, the Philistines had yet war again with Israel. And David went down and his servants with him and fought against the Philistines, and David waxed faint. And Ishbi-Benob, which was of the sons of the giant, the weight of whose spear weighed 300 shekels of brass in weight, he being girded with a new sword, thought to have slain David. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, succored him and smote the Philistine and killed him. Then the men of David sware unto him, saying, Thou shalt go no more out with us to battle, that thou quench not the light of Israel. So now Abishai is the protector of the Lord's anointed. That's what David was, the Lord's anointed. And we're going to see later, when I show you something else, that Abishai made a full turn to being a man of great faith. Remember, way back at the beginning, he was just like Joab. So what happens to Joab? And then we'll take a final look at Abishai. What happens to Joab? Turn over to 1 Kings chapter 1. Now David is really starting to get old, and now another rebellion is about to start. 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 1. Now David was old and stricken in years, and they covered him with clothes, but he got no heat. Therefore his servants said unto him. Remember way back in the story of Abner, how his servants didn't understand that Abner was a great man, and David had to say to him, don't you get it? Now they get it. Said unto him, Let there be sought for my lord the king a young virgin, and let her stand before the king, and let her cherish him, and let her lie in thy bosom, that my lord the king may get heat. Skip down to verse 5. Then Adonijah, the son of Haggith, exalted himself, saying, I will be king. And he prepared him chariots and horsemen, and 50 men to run before him. And his father had not displeased him at any time in saying, Why hast thou done so? His father's David. And he also was a goodly man, and his mother bare him after Absalom. And he conferred with, verse 7, with Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and with Abiathar the priest, and they followed Adonijah, and they following Adonijah helped him. So now what's going to happen is Adonijah is going to have his own rebellion. David's plan is to make Solomon the king, but now Adonijah, one of his other sons, says, no, I'm going to be king. And so he plans his rebellion with Joab. His uncle, well, his cousin, actually. It would be his cousin. They plan the rebellion. And of course what happens is David anoints Solomon as the king. Even though David's still alive, he anoints Solomon as king. And pick it up over in verse then said David, call Zadok the priest, verse 32 of 1 Kings chapter 1 verse 18. And Nathan the prophet and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and they came before the king. And he says, take the servants of your Lord, and cause Solomon my son to ride upon mine own mule, and bring him down to Gihon. And they make Solomon king, and then of course Adonijah finds out, and he runs away, and then Joab finds out. You know, I lost the verse where Joab finds out. That's all right. Do I have it here? Hold on. In 1 Kings chapter 5. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Skip over to 1 Kings chapter 2. In verse 1. Now the days of David drew nigh that he should die, and he charged Solomon his son, saying, I go the way of the earth. Be thou strong, therefore, and show thyself a man. Now skip over to verse 5, and look what it says. He says, moreover, Thou knowest also what Joab the son of Zeruiah did to me, and what he did to the 2 captains of the hosts of Israel, unto the son of Jether, whom he slew, and shed the blood of war in peace, and put the blood of war upon his girdle and upon his loins, and in his shoes that were on his feet. Do therefore according to thy wisdom, and let not his hoar head go down to the grave in peace. So after Joab is duplicitous in the rebellion of Adonijah, David on his deathbed is speaking to Solomon, and he says, you know what Joab did. You know the kind of guy he was. You do what you think is right, but don't let that man go to die in peace. That is a pretty strong condemnation of the man who was the captain of his host for some 30 to 35 years. And look what happens in the story. Verse 28 of chapter 2. Then tidings came to Joab, for Joab had turned after Adonijah, though he turned not after Absalom. And Joab fled to the tabernacle of the Lord, and caught hold on the horns of the altar. And it was told King Solomon that Joab was fled unto the tabernacle of the Lord, and behold, he is by the altar. So why does he grab the altar? Why is he fleeing to the tabernacle and grab the altar? Because nobody's supposed to be killed inside the tabernacle. Not supposed to shed blood inside the tabernacle unless it's sacrificial blood. But Solomon understands the wisdom of the situation as opposed to just the rule of law. And what Joab is doing, Job's trying to hold on to the rule of law. They'll never kill me in here. You're not going to come in and deface the tabernacle. Solomon's not worried about that. And and it was told unto King Solomon, verse 29, that Joab was fled unto the tabernacle of the Lord, and behold, he is by the altar. Then Solomon sent Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, saying, Go fall upon him. And Benaiah came to the tabernacle of the Lord and said unto him, Thus saith the king, Come forth. And he said, Nay, but I will die here. And Benaiah brought king to the word, saying, Thus saith Joab. And thus he answered me. And the king said unto him, Do as he hath said, and fall upon him, and bury him, that thou mayest take away the innocent blood which Joab has shed from me and from the house of my father. And then turn over to verse 34. So Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, went up and fell upon and slew him, and he was buried in his own house in the wilderness. So Benaiah went into the temple, said, Okay, this is where you want to die. This is where you're going to die. And he kills him. And he drags his body out. And notice it says he's buried in his own house in the wilderness. He's not buried in his family's house. He's not buried with his fathers. And also he's buried in the wilderness. I read a very interesting article one time that says the wilderness, it says the wilderness because that's where people go to have a good time, and he was a partier, and he was absolutely not. The wilderness is the wilderness of sin. And eventually that's where Joab had to die. He had to die in the wilderness, had to be buried in the wilderness because that's the life he lived. He lived a life in the wilderness. Everything he did was about Joab. That's why it talks about he's buried in his house in the wilderness. That's the man Joab. He was an evil guy from the beginning to the end. Every thought of the imagination of his heart was evil continually, and every action that he did was evil continually. In contrast to him, his own brother, who was just like him, what happens to him? And that's found back in 2 Samuel 23, verse 3 and 18. These be the names of the mighty men whom David had. And we talked about the mighty men of Israel. Remember, we talked about way back in the first class. And the mighty men of Israel were the mighty faithful men of Israel. Not just the mighty warriors. Many of them were mighty warriors. But they were the mighty faithful men. And we know that because of the top 3 guys. You remember the story of the top 3 guys? Those are the 3 guys who in the midst of the battle, David said, I thirst. I wish I could get water from the well at Bethlehem. And these guys put their swords aside and went right across through the enemy lines and right back with a glass of water. Remember, David pours out the water. Those are the top 3 guys in the list of the mighty men of Israel, the mighty faithful men of Israel. And this is what it says in verse 18. And Abishai, the brother of Joab, that's where I started, the son of Zeruiah, that's where he started, was chief among 3. So this is the way the list is listed. You've got the 3 guys at the top, the 3 men who got that water from the well in Bethlehem. Then you have another 3 guys. And those 3 guys are above everybody else. So you have the top 3 and the second 3. And the top of the second 3, Abishai, the son of Zeruiah. Of all that list of faithful men, he is specifically taught. He's not like the 3 at the top, but he's the first person below the 3 at the top of all the faithful men that David had. That's the position that he gets. And the position that Joab gets is death in the wilderness, in his own house in the wilderness. And that's how we are transformed. We are transformed because God opens his heart to us. Why us? That's God's situation. But it's not because we are somehow better or greater or we have some sort of special whatever. God has chosen us to shine his light forth. And in the end, that's exactly what Abishai does, because he's transformed by the power of God. And that's where special comes from. Joab rejected it his entire life. And his entire life was just a waste of time. In the end, it's just a historical story. He's just buried in his house in the wilderness. And yet Abishai is among the mighty men who will live forevermore because God opened their heart and they received that opening. So that's the story of the sons of Zeruiah. I hope you've enjoyed these classes.